I'm going to do a quick drawing based on one of these specimens from St. George's, and the one I'm looking at is the spinal column that's deformed by Pott's disease. And it can be quite intimidating if you're faced with a blank canvas or paper and quite a complex structure to work from. But what I always suggest is start very, very lightly and loosely, and you can tighten up your drawing as you go. If you start too tight and too neatly, if you make a mistake in either the structure or the scale, it's harder to undo. And I'll just be using a very plain HB pencil, relatively sharpened, and I'm going to start quite lightly, as I said, because what I'm looking to do is just pick out the main structures of the object that I'm looking at, and I'll be tightening this up later as I go. And if you look at any spinal column, what they basically have is what's known as the body of the vertebra. And what's interesting about this particular specimen, obviously, is it's curved completely over. So while you still get this sort of vertebral column here, it's actually in this area where it's curved over, completely fused. So as well as your sort of spinal body, you also have these knobbly bits coming out of the back of the spine. And what's also interesting about drawing a spine is that they come out at different angles. It's interesting but also quite tricky. So you have things coming out from the back of it, and these are called the spinal processes. And if you ever run your hand down your spine or someone else's spine, this is what you feel under your skin. So they actually help. If you start sketching those in, they will help to make those decisions about the location and proportions. So very loosely, the spinous processes will follow the path of the spinal body. So you can sketch that in very lightly so that it's sort of in proportion. And again, they tend to be wider at the base of the spine. Now, I am not entirely sure which part of the spinal column this is, so I'm not sure as to how normal the size of these various parts are. However, it's absolutely fascinating, and at the same time it's quite it sort of makes me feel a huge amount of empathy for the person that must have suffered this terrible disease because of the unnatural way that the bones have been formed and fused. So as well as your spinal body and your spinous processes, you have other parts of bone which come out of the spinal body called the transverse processes. And they sort of come out at an almost 45-degree angle. So when you're looking at this from the side, it's quite hard to tell actually what angle they come out at. But if you're just aware of their location and existence, again, this can kind of help you to get the proportions in of the part of the specimen that you're looking at. And I can see already as I'm getting these parts in that my proportions are a little bit out here, so I'm just going to adjust this slightly. It's actually a smaller angle of this particular part of the spine, which means that all these bits will have to come down as well. So it's looking a little untidy, and there's a lot going on here. But as I said, it's easier if you keep it quite loose, and then we can work back into it a bit later and really sort of tighten it up. And this is a particularly tricky bit because it's hard to see exactly which bits of the bone you're drawing here. Not only that, they're coming out from the spinal column, turning an angle and sort of coming back towards you. But again, if you just sketch those things in very lightly, you can start to see how they start to make shape. They look as if they're slightly broken off there, which might be the case. But nonetheless, if you draw what you see, rather than what you think you see, even though it doesn't look correct, and obviously nothing about this particular spine is entirely correct, if you draw what you see, then it will all start to come together as you work your way through it and start to build up your image. of this very, very complex structure here. What's interesting in this particular section is the spinous processes are actually fused together, so you almost have like a flat plate, a bit like what you might find on a dinosaur. And this again helps you to get the rest of your parts into some kind of appropriate proportion. Another interesting thing when you're drawing in this particular specimen is photographed white on black, so you can see quite clearly the spine against the background. And what you can do with this is, rather than look at the body of the object that you're drawing, you can look instead at the shapes made by the gaps. For example, down here there's a bit of a gap which is almost but not quite oval, and if rather than drawing the object you draw the gap, what happens is that starts to put the rest of it into proportion. And by drawing the shape of this particular space, you can see that it started to indicate where the other parts of the specimen fit together. And this drawing this shape creates the form of this bit. And you can see I'm sort of adjusting the proportions as I go along, because my original sketching was a little bit too high up. And you can do this with the exterior shape as well. If you have a look at this, once you start to get these parts into approximately the right sort of proportion, and I'm just going to draw the shape of the gap just below that first one, and you can see they fall on my original line where I'd sort of very lightly sketched out where the path that the spinal column should follow. So if I just put that in, that starts to show me where this particular body of the spine, where that fits in and how it fits in with above it. And there's another little shape here you can use to draw the negative space to show you where this part should go. At this stage you don't need to worry too much about the shading, but if you want to put it in very lightly, it'll start to give a bit of form to the shape of the spine. And basically any object will cast a shadow wherever it changes direction. So if you put that shadow in, it starts to indicate where the light and dark areas are. And when you start to see where the light and dark areas are, that's when you can start to see the three-dimensionality of this object. So at the moment it's still mostly line, but I'm just very lightly starting to put in some of the shadow, which will help me to get an idea of the form of this particular specimen. Again, I'm just going to adjust this a little spinous process because I can see that the shape is not quite right here. And at this point here is where it starts to fuse, it begins to fuse with the processes above it. And again, these are very useful because these shapes are very useful because if you draw the shape accurately, so rather than draw the body of the spine, you draw this shape, you can start to see how it fits in to the rest of the specimen. And I'm just going to block in the background here a little bit darker, so you can start to see how that works. At this stage I wouldn't bother erasing before this because you're still trying to get your specimen into some sort of shape. It's almost like you're moulding it with your pencil rather than just drawing. But now that I'm starting to feel that some of these are correctly aligned, I can take out some of my sketch lines. You see that? And that starts to help again to denote the shape that you're attempting to draw. Now what's really nice but also very, very difficult about a specimen such as this, which is slightly different from the normal. It's abnormal, basically. It makes it more complex, but it also gives you a lot of really nice textures that you can begin to play with. And if you'll notice that to begin with, I've used my pencil very, very lightly, just to put in my guidelines and my shading to give me an idea of what's going on at various places. But what you can do once you start to get these into what looks like the right proportion, you can start to press a little harder. And obviously I haven't changed pencil, this is the same pencil. You can press a little harder and start to get a little bit more definition into your drawing. And as you're doing that, you can see I'm diverging slightly from my original marks because I can see they weren't quite in the right place. But by using this concept of negative space, by drawing the gaps rather than the specimen, I can start to get a feel for the correct proportions of this particular object. And bone is such a wonderful thing to draw because it has this sort of solidity, but it also has so much texture. And for example, in areas like this, it's a little bit of shading that I'm just going to put in with cross-hatching, and that's where you draw lines one way and draw lines the other way over the top. But it also has this slight dimpling, so there are holes in the bone. You can see that it's almost porous. And this area now that I'm looking at it, there is another shape just above here. So if I just draw that shape in, it's in front of the transverse processes, so it's possibly part of the spine that's attached to the spinal column. But that's given me a sort of location for this particular bone, which is coming off the spinal column and coming out slightly towards the viewer. Starts to define the shape here that's in front of it. I'm just going to take out some of my sketch lines, and you can see immediately that that starts to get the sense that it is in fact coming out of the spinal column and coming slightly towards you. And what's interesting about drawing is you see things differently. If you photograph an object, you have an exact likeness of it, but you don't have the same memory of it. When you're drawing it, you focus very intently on certain individual parts of it, and you might see things that you wouldn't otherwise have noticed if you were just looking either at the object or if you were just looking at a photograph of it. And studies have shown that if you photograph things, you retain the photograph, but you don't retain any real memory of looking at it. And it's quite different from either just staring at it or, even better, studying it while you draw. And while I'm drawing, I'm probably spending at least half my time looking at the object and half the time looking at the paper. Possibly more time looking at the object than actually at my hand as I'm drawing. And this is very important. You have to constantly look at the object you're working from, because if you spend too long looking at your drawing, you can't see if you've made any kind of error. So I'm just going to have a quick look, and now I'm using the negative space of the exterior part of the spinous process, and I'm balancing it against the internal negative spaces that I've drawn here. So between the two, I should be able to get something that is proportionately accurate. I'm just going to put this little space in here as well. And as before, as I come round checking the relationship between these various features, the gap in the fused processes and where the transverse processes are coming slightly out at an angle. Now I can see that some of my original sketch marks are not quite in proportion. And that doesn't matter because I've done them quite lightly, and I can now put in, working from both the bottom up and the top down, I can find the right shape that will make that start to look the same proportion as the specimen that I'm drawing from. And again, I probably wouldn't normally do this till later on, but I'm just going to put this in so you can start to see how these negative spaces create the positive space of the object that you're drawing. And I'll just take out some of my original marks. So you can see how this is really coming together as the specimen is. And I'm going back in now just to look at some of the shadows. And the shadows obviously are what make your drawing look three-dimensional. And the shadows happen where part of the object is blocking the light from other parts of it. So there's no real, shadows aren't really a line on the page as I've got here. They're actually where two parts catch the light differently. So if you make one part lighter and the other part darker, you create the illusion of a line and the illusion of a three-dimensional object, which is what we're going for here. So I'm just going to put in this foramen, and this is within a slightly shadowed bit where it's overhung by these other parts of the bone. So just underneath there, if I make that darker, and this bit too, and then I just lift out some of my initial study lines, you can see how that immediately starts to come towards you on the page. And there are a few little holes and textures here in the bone. Now again, I've got a little bit of a line here, and I don't really want that because I want it to look more three-dimensional, so I'm just going to make the shadow behind it a little bit darker, and that will give it the sense that it's coming out towards you. Now what you can do with your lines, and I talked about cross-hatching where you go one way and then the other way to build up texture, but you can also use your cross-hatching lines to follow the line of the object. And this very much sort of indicates how the bone has moved and curved around this point. And that gives you an extra sort of sense of the three-dimensionality of this particular object. And I can see here where the next bone that's coming out of this is coming up. And this is tricky because there's a lot of shadow going on here, but generally this is a little darker. This is where this protruding piece of bone has broken off, and it's casting a shadow on the bone behind it, which itself has a fair amount of texture going on it. So drawing really is a matter of picking out the differences between the lights and shadows as much as it is about picking out the forms and the shapes of the object that you're drawing. And this will relate to whatever you're drawing, whether it's a medical specimen, a dry specimen, a wet specimen, or whether it's a piece of fruit or a bowl. And it's particularly true if you've ever tried to draw something like an egg, which is a very, very good drawing exercise and to be recommended. I'm just lifting out some of my dark lines because they're looking a little too strong, and I'm just going to put the shading in, not with a solid line, but just with a few marks to give it that sort of slight texture that makes it so uniquely what it is.